Welcome to the Global Tech Leaders Podcast, where we help business leaders and individual contributors with actionable insights to hit their number and figure out the nuances of truly operating a business globally today, squeezing the essence of the lessons learned from the planet's top tech leaders. This is your guide to joining the fast track to global market scaling.
So today we are joined by Yanev Suissa. If you check out his LinkedIn, I think he's probably one of the most humble profiles I've ever come across. He's had the exposure to many things across his career thus far, and in my mind has lived about 5 lives already, from Broadway to studying gangs, to starting a fund of 4 startups themselves. He's worked under the Bush and Obama governments on renewable energy, is outspoken on public sector and the direction it's headed, and had the good fortune to invest in companies like Databricks, SentinelOne, and Evolve. He's a big nose in the Valley as well as the New York and Washington, D.C. areas, and moreover has been to not only a handful, but 160 countries. Quite honestly, don't know how you've managed to fit that all into where you are now, Yanni. But welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ross. I'm excited to chat with you.
Well, start from the beginning, if you would. Your college days. I know you spent a bit of time in Australia, as did I. Something I'm pretty passionate about in terms of an international experience. But how the hell do you arrive to where you are today and have taken in so much along the way? Maybe share with us some of your journey, if you would.
Sure, happy to do so. My journey's a little strange. You know, when I talk to people about, I get asked by a lot of younger folks, how do I get to have like a job like yours? And I would say, not the way I did it. So I've come about where I am now from a pretty diverse set of backgrounds. So throughout my college years and graduate schools, which I did a lot of, as you know, I studied, the political science world. I have degrees in law and business, criminology and criminal law. That's where I spent some time, living with some gangs, doing interesting research on kind of the sociological and political structure of deviant groups and things like that, which seems a little strange for where I am now, but it was, at the time I had an interest in being a prosecutor. So at the same time was doing some performance on the side, which I love to do, doing some entrepreneurship, working on 1 or 2 startups. And then from there, from all of that schooling, which I also say made me highly leveraged with a ton of debt, which is now luckily gone, I was recruited into the Bush administration, which I never thought I would work for. I had debated starting a social enterprise, joining a law firm, doing a business. There were a lot of different things I could do, but ended up getting recruited with just a great opportunity. At the time, the Bush administration was building a program, but was starting to build a program that would be $42.5 billion to fund new innovative tech projects, particularly in the energy infrastructure, renewable energy space. And they needed someone to help build it. So I was the first full-time person hired to do that. It was something I was completely unqualified for. Had a bit of experience through summers and stuff in finance and investing, but not a ton. Didn't really know much about energy, but just saw it as a great opportunity. And then the recession hit, which I like to joke was the best thing that ever happened to my career. In that Obama gave our group another $100 billion, and so give or take. And so, when you control a lot of money in a recession, you and your group have a lot of money in a recession, you end up becoming pretty popular. Sure. And so was recruited by, a lot of the big venture guys, was at NEA, the big firm, for a while, and then eventually started my own. But there is kind of a theme, although it's a little bit disconnected and not necessarily where I thought I'd be, I think there's still some connectivity to it at a pretty high level, and kind of the way I think about things, which we could delve into if you want, or we could talk more about the career.
So I'm curious to know, you're clearly being in the venture space quite a bit, and you said at the outset, if you want to follow my career, don't do it the way I did it. But for me, I think you have an ability to recognize an opportunity, right? And you also spoke there about joining a program or being given an opportunity that you felt utterly unqualified for. But you've clearly been able to take on a challenge. Maybe talk to me about imposter syndrome, or how you kind of just dove in with that feet first.
Yeah, I always say I have imposter syndrome, but I also think it's a good thing. I know a lot of folks think of it as a negative, but from my perspective, I have a few rules about jobs and career development, and to some extent, they also apply just to day-to-day life. And one of my key rules for jobs is that I always take something I'm unqualified to do. And I have done that throughout my career. Had no business doing a lot of the things I ended up doing. But that's the only way you grow, right? There's two kinds of hires, I think, in the world. There are the kind of hires where this person has done this forever. They're an expert, number one in their swim lane, have done that for a long time, and that's great. And they may be very good at the job you're hiring them for. And that's one approach, which is neither better or worse than the other approach, which is, hey, I'm just going to hire someone who has, a lot of different background, I think is smart and can pick it up pretty quickly. Maybe has been in a lot of swim lanes, not as, the number one swimmer, but as a top swimmer in several. And that kind of diversity of perspectives and ability to kind of hit the ground running is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a different take or a different set of perspectives rather than necessarily a deep single lane skill set. And for me, I've always taken that broader approach. And if you take that broader approach, you're kind of always doing something you haven't done before, which brings a little bit of that imposter syndrome, but I think it's good.
Yeah, you talked about in some of your notes we were sharing ahead of today's call about being a good swimmer in a number of lanes rather than the best swimmer in a particular lane. Tell me, that's obviously allowed you to grow because you're clearly taking on a challenge. But tell me, maybe, how does that translate into the venture world and how you eye up investments? Like, what is it you're looking for by way of kind of a kinship or an affinity when you're eyeing up investments?
It's interesting. I learned this over the years, and I see it more and more the more I look at things, that people, when you have a background that's different or a set of different backgrounds that you can bring to a new sector, a new industry, it can really be transformative and allows for innovation in a different way, right? There's a lot of great journalists with engineering degrees, which would surprise people. Most of the top performing lawyers were physicists. And in my world, for venture, when I was at NEA, New Enterprise Associates, which is one of the biggest venture funds out there, and had a great time there, a fantastic firm that trained me really well. I was one of the only senior government guys at any of the big venture firms and top funds as an investor. There's a few exceptions, but there's very few of people who've crossed over between those worlds. And so after many years doing it, I realized at NEA, hey, there's an opportunity here where, my background in public sector, which also I think links to some of what I call the non-traditional industries, the manufacturing, infrastructure, health. In the regular world, they're traditional. In the tech world, they're non-traditional. And then, of course, the venture world, right? The innovation and what was going on in the Valley, the ability to kind of see all of those different lanes, understand how they work together, and be able to navigate them was really important and added huge value. And so my new fund, SineWave, we've been at it now, not really new anymore. We've been at it for a little while, is really built off the intersection of those. And, there's folks out there doing things on the edges, but very few who I think have done what we did. You need a unique set of backgrounds, you need a diverse set of experiences, and you also need a team with those kind of backgrounds, which is not the easiest to come by. And so I think that's really given us an edge in the venture world.
Interesting. So talk to me about the personalities you're coming across. So, a lot of the investment world is also finding somebody you feel you can work with in a productive way. So Talk to me about, when you're eyeing up an investment, like personality styles and what it is you're looking for. They may not be exactly the same as you, but that you complement each other, or you can help them and you can help each other, as it were. What is it do you look for, and what are major red flags in your world?
Yeah, so I'll focus specifically on the people side of things to answer this question, but we could delve into broader business, focuses or tech things afterwards if you want. But on the people side of things, specifically, interestingly enough, NEA, my old fund, which has done thousands of investments over the years, they've been around since the very beginning of venture, once did a study of all the different investments that they'd been in to try and see if there was anything correlated with success. And team was the only thing that they found to have a significant correlation to success, whether the team had worked together before. And I think the reason for that is because people are so important to venture. I always say in venture, there's a science to getting rid of the gimp horses in a race, but there's a few thoroughbreds, and which thoroughbred wins is anybody's guess. And so it's all about how the people around that thoroughbred, how the team behind it, and everyone is doing everything to make that horse win the race. That's how you succeed in what is a lot of luck. I mean, like I said, there's some science to getting down to it. But then afterward, it's a lot of luck, but the way you manage luck is by bringing a significant team around it. And so the specific qualities, you need someone who's coachable. There's a lot of entrepreneurs who think they know everything, and there's a lot of VCs who think they know everything. A lot of people generally who think they know everything. You need to know what you don't know. You need to know how to build a team. So finding a team, being able to recruit and encourage and find the right team members is crucial. Being able to navigate networks and relationships, both customer-wise and otherwise, financially, being able to raise money is crucial. And I think also just being able to be flexible and pivot and see where things are going and adjust to the market, right? It can't be, whatever you started with, I don't think there's a single startup that started with, on day one, you thought it was going to be this. And I guarantee you on day 20, it was something different. And on day 100, it was completely different than that. And on day 500, it's completely different from that. And if you can't navigate those changing waves, you ultimately fail. And so you really need an entrepreneur who has that kind of grit and ability to adjust. In VC, we use the word pivot, which is a typical buzzword, but I really do think that that's accurate.
So maybe could you share with us a couple of examples of, investments or companies you've had the good fortune of being involved in that started out a particular direction and then just dramatically shifted, but to ultimate success?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me think of a really good example here. I'll give you an example of one of our startups that's at fairly early stage right now. It's a company called Paperspace. They're in the AI machine learning space. And they had initially, thought that the best fit for them was in the enterprise sales arena. And so they were really focusing on big company enterprise sales type of relationships. And that was going and it was fine. But what the other basis that we realized that from a thesis perspective was this company really needed a different approach to the market, right? Rather than jumping in early stage to enterprise sales, they really had this key asset, which I don't think initially we had mobilized as effectively as we could, which was their community, right? So they had a huge developer community that they were, and going to my point about relationships and networks, right? They had a huge developer community that they were nurturing, that was growing, is still the largest developer community in the space. And kind of taking a bottoms up approach. We saw this in our investment in Databricks, by the way, same kind of thing, where you really focus on that community and build that community and enhance the products that they need. And from there, on top of that, you can layer enterprise sales. Once you understand once you've built this kind of sticky infrastructure around you with people at all different organizations and all different enterprises giving you feedback on what works and doesn't work and contributing to the development of what you're building, that's a different kind of approach that they've shifted to. And so it's a risky, it's from the typical entrepreneur's eye, it might be risky in that you're not going to go out for a fundraise with that kind of philosophy and talk about revenue numbers, right? Because revenue is secondary to building the community. You're going to talk about community traction and user growth, which some VCs don't always understand, especially as you start to grow, right? You may not really be focused on your revenue numbers until a later series, like a series C or D. But once you get to B, there's a lot of folks who can't see beyond the revenue, right? But there are some great examples, hopefully like Paperspace as it continues to grow, certainly like Databricks, that have really succeeded taking that approach to things.
So I really want to dive into that. And I'm sure you've kind of seen the TV show Silicon Valley, and, you know, there's a lot of talk about pre-revenue and, you know, obviously there's pressure on revenue. And the other side of the house is that there's a huge amount of VC and PE action at the moment, that there seems to be a kind of a liquidity abundance at the moment around investments. So how do you discern whether, you know, it's okay to be focused on pre-revenue right now versus somebody who's also pre-revenue but not as investable with the abundance of liquidity out there at the moment? Like, what's the discerning factor there? You mentioned community. What other salient aspects do you feel are important in that equation?
Well, so I think it's an art, not a science, but I can say a few things about it. I would say that in enterprise tech, you know, you have to really understand each of the different theses and markets. So one thing that's different about SineWave, my fund, is we have a very specific thesis about everything, and we do not do, you know, a lot of venture is what we call kind of spray and pray. You do a lot of, you know, you spray a bunch of money around to different deals, and you hope for one to be the big win or two to be the big wins. We have a very concentrated portfolio, so we only do about 12 to 15 deals a fund. So we're able to really focus on a particular thesis, and in that you can understand and spend time not only with the tech companies out there and the entrepreneurs, but also with the customers and the partners and the ultimate users and buyers of the tech. And that often gives you an inclination as to what the right business approach is to this. You know, technology is what everyone, especially in enterprise, people tend to focus on as the key differentiating factor. But we just talked about how team can be a differentiating factor and recruiting the right team members. Another one is business model, right? That not everybody always puts an emphasis on, but the business model can sometimes be a huge asset in the enterprise space. Also, particularly in the consumer space, it tends to play a big role, even though that's not what we invest in. And so I think that that's, you know, one of the key elements of discerning, you know, whether what you should be looking for. What are the key performance indicators when a company comes to you? And it shouldn't be a standard rule, right? So there are some VCs who are like, if you don't have 5 million, we're not investing in you. I don't think that's a well-informed rule, right? That doesn't say anything about the company or what they're doing or their tech or their business or their industry. It's kind of it's a superficial rule. And not sometimes they'll say, oh, we got to own this much. Also a superficial rule. I'd much rather own, you know, 20% of Facebook than 100% of MySpace, right? And so you got to really, you got, yeah, right. You got to be flexible on these things. And if you have a great company, a great entrepreneur, you understand the space, you have the relationships, then you can make great bets. The other thing I'd say on your liquidity point is, this is something that a lot of, you know, folks are afraid to talk about, but there is a lot of money in the market. But there's also a lot of dumb money in the market. And by dumb, they're not dumb people or dumb investors. They're just dumb investors when it comes to venture, right? So people think venture is finance. It is to some extent, but like I don't really do finance, right? What I do is I build teams. I look at technologies. I look at markets. I find partnerships. I find customers, right? That's what my entrepreneurs are doing, right? Whether they're going to be $1 billion one day, you know, 5 years from now or not is kind of you know, of course you can visualize how that is possible, but it's finger in the wind, right? Like who knows what it could be. And so, you know, it's really a different kind of investing. It's not ratio analysis and financial model manufacturing, at least at the early stages. We invest seed A and B. So at those early stages, it's a lot more about the team, the tech, the market, and things of that nature. And so from that perspective, you have a lot of later stage investors trying to get earlier and earlier. I actually think this is, I'm writing an article now on how Uber actually created this craze in that Uber stayed private for so long, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, so remember, if you remember, Ross, Uber stayed private for so long, right?
Yeah.
And so all these investors had FOMO, and everybody wanted to be in the companies in the private. So everybody wanted to start doing venture, and you had folks like, everyone knows the SoftBank story, and Fidelity and Goldman Sachs, and everybody's doing these early stage deals, and they're throwing money in, and because it doesn't matter to them because they have so much money, right? And that doesn't pan out often. And unlike some other industries, it takes 10 years to know if it pans out. Venture is a long game, right? So there's a lot of stuff that happens in venture that, you know, takes a little while for people to realize they made a mistake. And so I think that you have a lot of liquidity, but smart liquidity that can help the entrepreneurs, that knows what it's doing, is not as rife. And the other thing I say is the best entrepreneurs know how to pick smart liquidity, smart money, right? And that's a key thing also. If you're a great entrepreneur, you should be thinking about who's the right investor for me? Do they get it? Have they done this before? And you don't just chase after, you know, random investors' valuation. That's the wrong that's the wrong focus in my mind.
Great points, really great points. And I suppose as I think about that, I'm interested to know, what do you feel are the differences across the US? So you're obviously Washington, D.C. based, but you've had a lot of experience in the Valley. And you talked previously before we got on the show today about in and out of the Valley. How does attitude towards investment and entrepreneurship and money differ from, you know, in New York City to a DC to a Valley kind of setup? What are those cultural differences?
So that is a great question. I think you end up finding two types of VCs. You find Valley-focused only VCs, and you find kind of non-Valley or very sector-specific or very geographically specific VCs. We're a both. So from the beginning, we've had, kind of like NEA, my old firm, we've had an office in both Silicon Valley and New York, and DC, and also some team in New York. So we've always been virtual. We have, or at least we communicate a lot of the times virtual, even though we go back and forth between offices. And we have senior partners in both the Valley and in DC and on the East Coast. And that's really important. And the reason is because in the Valley is such a hub of talent and technology, particularly in the enterprise space. It attracts, right? Success begets success, wealth begets wealth. Similar talent follows talent, right? And so, you know, a lot of the greatest startups are from entrepreneurs who left Facebook, or who will leave Databricks when they go public, right? Things of that nature. They become the great kind of pool for the next generation of new tech startups. And so you have a lot of that in the Valley. So you need to be there. You need to understand that world. The Valley is, you know, very futuristic. What can it be? What could it be? Always looking that way. And I think that that's exciting. You have to judge, of course, as an investor, you know, is this 20 years futuristic, or is this 5 to 10 years futuristic? Everyone has a different time frame. But the Valley's fantastic at that. What they're not fantastic at is realizing that 90% of the real world is not in the Valley. I would argue, you know, more than half of what they think matters in the Valley doesn't matter outside of their 25-mile radius. Or no one cares about it outside their 25-mile radius. And so you need to have that broader perspective. As tech, our thesis at SineWave actually is that that everything we invest in is actually completely relevant to your Googles and Ciscos and Amazons of the world. But it's also relevant to the non-Valley part of the world. It's relevant to those industries. It's relevant. We call them kind of like the Fortune 480, like your Monsantos and your Caterpillars and your Alcoas and your Walmarts and your Fords, like all the different kind of players. But it's also relevant to the public sector, which is one of the biggest buyers and customers in the tech world that people forget. And by the way, the public sector has, by extension, has tentacles into all those companies. And now you see it has tentacles into Google and Amazon and all these places that have now built in DC, right? And so, and those worlds, those traditional industries love what you could be, but they're looking for reliability, right? And I would say we translate a lot when we're talking through customers with our startups. You know, when you're in the Valley, you sell like what's coming 5 years from now. When you're talking to the government or to an established big enterprise company, right? You talk about what you can do now in a reliable way effectively,
Yeah.
right? And so it's a very different kind of pitch and perspective. That's important, right? So you need to be able to see what's happening and what's coming, because that's, primarily driven by the Valley, although there are other pockets of it. But you also need to know what's really happening in the current world and what can be adopted now, because you're not just selling to Google and Cisco anymore. If you want to be a massive company, you're selling to all of the 500 of the Fortune 500, right?
Very, very good point. So I guess it takes a level of maturity from a stability perspective. Like, you're not buying into Google until you can show that your enterprise email platform is in fact an enterprise email platform, and it can cope with 5 nines uptime and be ultimately reliable from anywhere, be it off-prem, which there obviously is a leap of faith from a public sector perspective in order to buy into, which makes a ton of sense. One of the areas, though, that struck me from our kind of initial conversation was around the shift in public sector becoming more entrepreneurial as such. So you talked about the merging of two worlds, and you gave some fantastic examples. So talk to me about that kind of dichotomy. What is it that is being reinvented in the public sector at the moment, and why is some traditionally state-owned enterprises now going entrepreneurial? And let me just throw out SpaceX there as the prime example. What does that look like in your world, and why is that so exciting?
Yeah, I think the public sector has extended beyond what we think of as government. It's also been displaced and replaced, right? So SpaceX is an example of displaced and replaced. I think that's more recent, so I'm going to come to that. But on the extension of the public sector, right? The Beltway bandits like Amazon, like Lockheed and the Northrops of the world, right? That everybody thinks of, right? Are now being replaced by Amazon. Right? Amazon and Microsoft are the major cloud infrastructure providers to the public sector. The government runs on those companies now, right? They no longer build internally. With Palantir, which was one of the first startups to really, blow it out in the government effectively, we started to shift, right, toward the government has shifted toward going private, right? They also just can't keep up fast enough with the private advancement, which people talk about regularly. Then you have the displacement and replacement of the public sector, right? And so you see some ways it's working and some ways it won't, right? And so SpaceX is a great example, to your point, Ross, of that is basically NASA reinvented in private industry, right? And that's a big, big change, right? You also see, what people used to call as I would argue that that Facebook, to an extent, is a displacement of the public sector, in that what used to be the public forum, right, is now Facebook, the Agora in ancient times, so to speak, right? But government and those kind of platforms, it's now Facebook, right? It's why you see the state actors attacking private companies almost more than they're attacking the government. I wouldn't say more than they're attacking government in reality, but just as much as they're attacking the government, right? And so that shift is really important. And by the way, the government is its own Fortune 500 in itself, right? There's a lot of money, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of tentacles there. If you can get just one of those tentacles, you're a multi-billion dollar company, as you see with things like SpaceX already, right?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. If you look at the US economy and you look at some of the Fortune, even the Fortune 500, Fortune 100, you'll notice that their market cap and sometimes even just their revenue figures are actually bigger than some countries in Europe, which is kind of mind-blowing when you really kind of break it down, that there are companies out there that are actually bigger than countries, which I find absolutely phenomenal. One of the things that I'm also curious about is, I feel that technology is the ultimate democratizer. So you're starting to see that in cryptocurrencies and the like, where the lofty position of the Fed and the European Central Bank and the Bank of England is now somewhat challenged. Do you think government fears technology to some degree, or do you feel they have to adapt to technology, and do you feel that they should welcome it? And does that vary across different, I doubt would China welcome it as much as, an open and Western economy in, Western Europe or North America? What are some of your thoughts there from a more philosophical standpoint, if I could dare to ask?
So it's interesting that you went to crypto, because actually my example of where I think it won't work is actually the crypto world, which is maybe a contrarian position to a lot of people. But so there's this kind of fun phrase in just generally that, technology starts in porn and ends up in government. Right. And so actually, interestingly, pornography is one of the earliest, right? It's one of the earliest innovators of technology. Virtual reality existed in porn before it ever made its way into the mainstream, to mainstream, right? It's funny because they are really kind of the foray into that. And then the government is the latest adopter. My point about reliability, making sure it's happening, that is changing, right? In order to stay ahead of the curve, they've got to be innovative. They've got to move fast. They've got to try new things. They will still be among the slowest in terms of adopting, just because it's a big beast to try and move, right? And there's different requirements and different needs, right? A lot of the needs are the same as commercial, actually, when you're dealing with enterprise tech, but still, they can sometimes be slower to adopt. I will say once they adopt, the land and expand strategy, it's easier to land a regular private customer, harder to expand it. In the government, once you land it, expansion's easy. But going back to I diverged a little bit, but going back to the initial question and where that goes, I don't think the government is afraid of technology, but you have to remember who's in the government, right? So I think there's two dynamics at work. You have a lot of politicians who are trying to make rules about things that they don't understand. You saw it during the testimony for Facebook, what is a profile? Forgot, people just don't get it. What's a tweet, right? But also you have another dynamic, which is you have this kind of aversion to the public sector. It's almost illogical in the Valley or among some of the I would call it, and I'm middle of the road, but I would call it kind of the stereotypical liberal tech culture, right? Why would Amazon ever work with the government? Google had that huge uprising. So you have both the government knowing that everything that it does and our security and other things it's so important to be connected to tech. And then this kind of movement to some extent of tech trying to be disconnected from the government for what I think are largely uninformed reasons. I'll give you a very quick example. When they were tapping the phone during, I think it was the San Bernardino incident many years ago of Apple, that was really the start of the Valley just blowing up about the NSA, is in our phones. and my reaction is, of course the NSA is in our phones. Where have you been, right? And not only that, but I'd much rather the government who is taking this information anonymously, can't release it ever. There's some little guy in a basement somewhere reading my emails, sucks for them, right? But I'm pretty protected. And once in a while, there's going to be someone terrible that they're going to prevent from doing something terrible that makes me feel comfortable. Meanwhile, I get creeped out by the fact that you and I could mention SpaceX right now in this call. And literally an hour from now in my private email, I'm going to have ads for, the next rocket launch, trip, right? That's what's going to happen, right? And it is scary to me. For me, that's much more scary, but it's this kind of this disconnect. And then just to lastly talk about crypto, I think crypto is an example of where there's an attempt to replace the government that will fail. Right now, I think crypto is a great ride. I think there's, the blockchain is certainly very interesting technology and will have a future. But, the number one most important thing to any power infrastructure, of which the government is currency, right? And you can argue that Bitcoin's not currency, it's stored value, but let's be honest, it's currency. And that is never going to be released. We can let SpaceX, propel rockets into space. We're not going to let someone manage the international currency, the international money system, right? And so I think you'll see two or three things happen here. Putting aside quantum's impact on crypto and things of that nature, if you just look at the regulatory intersection between public and private here, what is going to happen in my mind is that the government is there's going to be a ton of regulation. It's going to be from people who don't understand it, right? Because crypto really started on two premises: anonymity and decentralization, right? So the desire to even interact with the public sector to get it right is so low, then you're going to get the worst potential outcome regulation-wise, as you can imagine. And then on top of that, actually the best example, just to kind of point it out, is China is developing, you see it in the press, is really negative on crypto right now. And they're developing a digital yuan, and their own cryptocurrency. And the Fed is considering the same thing. And that currency will not be anonymous, so that you don't have money laundering, you don't have other issues. It will not be decentralized. In fact, it will be as centralized as you can imagine, right? And there's some pros and cons to it. But I think that ultimately, crypto suffers from this regulatory element of things. There may be a place for it, but we're being naive if we think that it's going to be the monetary system of the world. Just one other little tidbit. Most people don't know this, but a significant amount of Bitcoin, I forgot the percentage, but it's higher double digits than you'd imagine, is owned by China. And so you already see kind of it. Yes, as in the Chinese government. So you already see these kind of national conflicts in the digital world, right? In crypto and the ownership of currency and how important it is. That doesn't play out, that doesn't end up being a free, decentralized, anonymous system at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, too right. I'm curious to know, you've been to a considerable number of countries. Probably about 3x the number I've been to, and I consider myself relatively well traveled. What drove you to go to 160 countries, and how did that shape your global outlook and your perspective from the US as a home? And how does that shape your cultural diversity and what you look for in your teams, etc.? Maybe just share with me some of that life experience, if you would.
I love that. Travel is my favorite thing to talk about. One of my rules about jobs is to always do something that's interesting to talk about at a cocktail party. Travel for me is also one of those things. So I've been to, I travel all the time. It actually started, I've always been a traveler. My family was always pretty adventurous. I think a sense of adventure is one of my values as a person and something that really drives me. But in college, really, my freshman year, we were a group of friends was going to go away for Christmas, and everyone canceled, and I'm like, well, screw it, I'm going to go myself. So I ended up going and traveling on my own. And I know you're from Europe, so Europeans, this is pretty natural to go and do your own trip, or go and adventure and stay in hostels and meet people. For Americans, it's becoming a little more understood, but wasn't like that for a long time. And so I ended up doing that and just continuing it and saying, if anyone wants to come along, great, but I'm not giving up the time I have to go explore because you're taking your time to make a decision, right? And I do it quite cheaply also. I've never spent over $50 on a place to stay. I always take local transport, do local things, walk around, stay in local homes if I can. And for me, the reason it's really informed a lot of my life. And I think my business to some extent also. It reminds you of a few things. One, I love people. And so you always meet interesting people with interesting stories. You get different perspectives on the world. You understand that not everything is the same as, some of us might see in our own little swim lane. And most importantly, I think you also realize that from a personal perspective that, hey, you're really grateful for you can be very grateful for what you have, right? I mean, if you go to a lot of parts of this world, you can live for a lot less and be very, very happy. There's a lot of people struggling with some very basic needs around the world. And I think that that's an important thing to understand. I think we lose perspective when we're in the grind too much about what really matters. And the other element of it is it's an opportunity, about, I'm sure you've talked with other folks about a lot of the kind of the personal growth craze, so to speak. And now I think also in business leadership, there's an element of this. It's kind of the meditation movement, which I am actually a fan of. and the science behind that. And travel is a form of meditation, right? Like, it allows me to take a break, to see the bigger picture, to think outside my box, right? And really take a moment to pause. And so for me, that's always been really exciting. And the last thing I say is I love people. Like, for me, that's one of my favorite things, is to meet people, see their spark, get to know them, help them realize their spark. And so whenever you meet someone, when you're from the same place or you've traveled to the same place, it allows for a connection that makes people much more comfortable, and you could dig under the surface more. And I find that in both business and in the regular world. Just yesterday, I was talking to an entrepreneur from Pakistan who there's quite a few entrepreneurs from Pakistan. Not a lot of people are connected in that world, but we met an entrepreneur from Pakistan, and I had just gone a year or two ago, I had gone climbing in the mountains in northern Pakistan. And so we automatically had an exciting connection that allowed us to, I think, relate and talk both personal and business on a very different level.
So I couldn't agree with you more. I totally agree with that. I support travel, and myself and my wife have decided that when our youngest is of an age, we're going to take a year out and just go and visit as many possible countries as we can. It's one of our life goals. But talk to me about the ultimate aim. When you retire, are you going to retire? Is that something you believe in philosophically, or do you still have to have a purpose? What as we kind of wrap up here, what does the end look like in terms of success for you and relaxing at some point in the future, Yanev?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of my career, luckily, kind of happened to me in that it just surrounded myself with smart people, saw opportunity when it presented itself. So one of my rules, I would say, you have to be open to opportunity. It has to present itself. The universe needs to present the opportunity, which doesn't always happen, right? You need to recognize that it's there, and you need to be willing to jump on it and take the risk, right? All of those steps, each one of them is a tough one, right? And so for me, I've really, when opportunity presents, I go. If there's a 4-week vacation and I have the opportunity to travel, I do it. If there's an interesting, exciting thing that maybe I didn't know before, I'm not qualified for, but great people, has an impact on the world, makes me feel like I'm growing and fulfilled, then I'm going to go do that. And so for long-term wise, for me, I'll be with SineWave for a while, but I do think there'll be other growth opportunities in directions that maybe have nothing to do with tech or have nothing to do with public sector, right? And I think it's important to stay open to all those things. Right now, I'm 100% committed to SineWave, and I think something that not all founders, we're interesting because we're like a startup investing in startups, right? But something that not all founders think about is, at least for me as a founder, I strongly value my team, right? So now I have an interesting balance between like all these great risk-taking opportunities that I could go and do anytime, and now a team that has bet on me and on our mission and on what we're building. And I feel a strong sense of obligation to them and helping them build and helping them grow. And so for me, that joy in itself will keep me here probably a lot longer than I would have done if it was on my own. But at the end of the day, I would like to get, I don't think I'll ever retire. It's just the growth and the intellectual stimulation is too much of a driver for me. But I will get further and further toward, right now, my shift from regular investing to kind of this intersection of public and private was a personal goal of trying to be able to impact the world in a different way. So now the things we invest in actually have a clear connection to things that are happening that help real systems. They help the health system, they help national security, they help various elements of our world that matter. And I think ultimately down the road, I want to get toward helping people's day-to-day lives in a very clear, direct way. So this has been an arc, and I think the arc will continue for a decade or two at least. But there's another end to the arc that's more, one-on-one, down to the individual level rather than the system level that we'll get to. And maybe we'll get to that through SineWave by being innovative and different like we've already been. So hoping that path continues.
Wow, what a comprehensive answer. I can't thank you enough. Well, look, it's been a real pleasure to host you on today's show. I very much enjoyed our conversation. I hope we can have you back on future shows if you're up for that. It's been tremendous value. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.
I would love that, Ross. And maybe we'll do the next show in my 170th country with you and your wife, somewhere random. It'll be fun.
You've been listening to the Global Tech Leaders Podcast, designed for both established and aspiring career-focused tech rock stars, as well as helping leadership figure out how to speak global in today's multicultural world. For further details, check out sf-talent.com.